All right, we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. I am Dr. Josh Turknett, and I am joined by my tenacious co-host, Dr. Tommy Wood. Hello, Tommy.
Hello.
Today's episode, we're going to be talking about a paper that relates kind of to an episode that we recently did around a study on brain training apps and video games that help for cognitive function. One of those mentioned was StarCraft 2. And we got some questions about like what other kind of options might be out there for taking advantage of video games for cognitive benefits, and which have shown some interesting and promising results. And one thing that has come up is that the specific kind of games, what the games actually do, seem to make a difference in terms of their benefits, and also could sort of explain the disparities that have been seen in terms of the results that have been gotten from, sort of traditional brain training apps versus studies looking at video games that sort of have a different type of approach. So there is a paper that's kind of a meta-analysis of a lot of this research that has some interesting findings and maybe can help provide some guidance to those who are looking to explore this avenue further. So Tommy's going to take apart that study and kind of give us the overview of what it says. So take it away.
Yeah, this is an area that people will know that Josh and I are both super interested in, and the many different ways that we might use more modern stimuli to support cognitive function. I think is really important, especially as those technologies continue to develop. And actually, there's some interesting points in this paper that will become more and more relevant, I think, as technology develop and as we all become exposed to even more of these different things. It's going to be harder to tease some of this stuff out because we're maybe getting exposed to them in various different ways. But this paper is called Effects of Action Video Gameplay on Cognitive Skills, a meta-analysis. It's in Technology, Mind and Behavior, is the journal. This was published in 2023. And this, I was saying to you, Josh, right before we jumped on, this is one of the most rigorous meta-analyses I've ever read in my entire life. It is incredibly exacting in terms of how they set up their searches, how they found the papers, what they did, what you did and didn't include, and why. And then they have a full online repository with all their code, all their papers, which I actually used because I needed to answer a question about one of the things that they were analyzing, and all of that's available. So, every step that they did, and they sort of updated their models after they pre-registered this. So, one of the kind of best practices in systematic review and meta-analysis is to say up front, these are the things we're going to do. This is how we're going to look for them. This is how we're going to analyze it, so that you can't change your approach later on because you didn't get the results you wanted, but you did, you found something and you want to focus on that instead. So that's not really the done thing. And so you can pre-register these things with databases like Prospero, where you sort of say this stuff up front. And one thing they did change was they improved their statistical models. So they kind of say that statistics improved between when we sort of saw advancements between when we registered this idea and then we actually did it. But then they also did it the old way as well, and then found the same things. But so if anybody's really interested in the process of meta-analyses, I highly recommend reading this paper. It is a cognitive stimulus in its own right. It's very long and very exacting, but super interesting for a statistics nerd like me. So they focus specifically on action video games, which they define as essentially first or third person shooter games like Halo or Call of Duty. So they were very specific about what video games they were looking at, both in terms of observational studies and interventional studies, and then what they were comparing it to. So I thought this was an interesting choice. There are certainly other types of video games that have been considered that we've talked about that are associated with improvements in cognitive function. So you mentioned StarCraft 2 from the Brain Clocks paper that we highlighted on the podcast recently. Things like Super Mario 3D World, several studies have used that. We've talked about those studies in the past as well. These were not included here, and they focused very much on these shooters because they wanted to try and sort of really focus on one specific type of game with that requires one specific set of skills, and then see how that affects cognitive function. Because if you start to include lots of different types of games, if they have different effects, you might sort of muddy the waters in terms of trying to find a true effect. Then, and I thought this is also interesting to look at because these types of video games are generally sort of looked down upon. They're like, they promote violence, they make people, reactive or aggressive. Where instead of thinking about what are the skills, the cognitive skills that are being trained in this kind of setting, and that sort of area is beyond this paper as well as beyond this podcast. But it certainly seems that when people are concerned about how these games might affect behavior, that's usually in the setting of other issues like histories of trauma and that kind of stuff. So they very specifically focused on young adults without any other kind of neurological or psychological issues or disorders. And I also thought this was interesting because young people are the ones where it's going to be hardest to drive an effect, right? They even say like these people are supposedly at the peak, their cognitive peak, whatever that is.
Right.
So it's going to be harder to drive an effect there. So I thought that was an interesting choice. Although there was one sentence in the paper where they were like, they kind of intimated that they didn't include papers that had older populations because they were like, the modern action video game is just too hard for old people. It's basically what it says. And I'm like, I'm not really sure about that. So that was the one thing that kind of raised my eyebrows.
Right.
And anybody of any age who's interested in playing Halo, please have at it.
Right. Yes.
You will be just fine. So then what they did is they looked at two different types of study. One was an observational study or observational studies where they took people or the studies that had people that played action video games compared to those that didn't. And the separation was more than 3 hours a week versus less than 1 hour a week. And they do kind of discuss later that they may have seen bigger effects if they'd restricted to studies where that contrast was bigger. Like some people, maybe the video gaming group playing 5 or 8 hours a week plus, because there does seem to be like a time effect. So then they also, and this is where I had to dig into their data, they looked at the effects when the recruitment for the study was overt or covert. So overt being you put out an advertisement that says, hey, we want to look at the cognitive functions of video gamers. Please join our study. And then, they find a control group as well. But then, a certain type of person might say, oh, yeah, I'm smart and I play video games. I want to take part in this study. Right. So it kind of biases recruitment. But I hadn't really thought about covert recruitment. That was interesting. So I kind of looked at some of the studies that they counted as covert. And then these were studies where they'd asked people a whole bunch of stuff about all the things they do in their lives, without specifically mentioning they were looking at the effects of video games. And then later on, they separated out the data based on who played video games or not, and then looked at that. So, and they saw similar effects regardless of how individuals were recruited. And essentially, what they found in the observational studies, which is the first part of the meta-analysis, was that across all the cognitive domains, except for sort of bottom-up attention, which is like the most sort of primal components of attention, regulated by the amygdala, etc. The video gamers, regular video gamers, perform better than the non-video gamers. So this is a top-down attention, sort of like prefrontal, frontoparietal network, kind of salience network-driven attention, visuospatial skills, response inhibition. all of these were significantly better in the video gamers compared to the non-video gamers. They did find that there was some like small study effects, and this is very normal, right, in these kind of observational studies. So if you have a small study, it has an outsized effect size that's just driven by either biases in how the study was run, or just because these small studies have less power, so you're less likely to find the exact effect. There's a lot more variability there. But even after they accounted for those things in various different ways, they found that those differences between gamers and non-gamers held in terms of across all those cognitive domains. And they basically sort of surmised that gamers tend to perform better in cognitive domains that are required for good performance in these video games compared to non-gamers, which kind of makes sense. But that doesn't mean that those video games actually improve it. It might mean that I have good top-down attention and visual spatial skills, and therefore I'm good at Halo, therefore I enjoy Halo, therefore I play it more. Right. And so the effect sizes they found between the two groups were quite large. But then what you really want to know is, if I start to play these games myself, not being a natural gamer, might I expect to see some improvements? So then they looked at interventional studies, where the intervention was an action video game of this type, and then they had a control game, and they were also very exacting about what the control game was. So it shouldn't require rapid processing or anything like that. All that, the sort of like visual spatial responsive kind of skills. So it was kind of like role playing or turn-based or puzzle type games that don't have that same kind of action component. And then everything also had to be on screens. So playing these games on like a phone didn't count, because they kind of felt like that full sort of distributed attention and multitasking was an important part of the skills that are being developed by these games. And then essentially they found the same thing, but as with the observational data, but with much smaller effect sizes. So still a significant improvement in global cognition, particularly in attention, but then also those other skills, although individually the other skills that I mentioned earlier that were different in the observational studies were not statistically significant in the interventional studies, except for attention. But they were all sort of like positive. They all went in that same direction. So again, the kind of takeaway was that the skills and the different cognitive modalities that are required in order to perform well in these games are trained such that you can test them outside the setting of the game, and you will still see improvements, in these sort of like formal cognitive function tests. They also found that time did seem to have an effect. So like the more time you spent playing these games, the bigger the effect, although there was a bit of an issue there, because studies looked at different cognitive domains depending on how long individuals played the game for. So you couldn't like look at all the different cognitive domains across all the different time domains, because there just weren't enough studies to do that. But particularly, bigger effect sizes seen for perceptual skills in those studies that had people train for dozens of hours in a game, because that was the sort of the outcomes that they looked at. Because they were so exacting in how they selected the intervention studies, they saw much less heterogeneity across the different studies and less like study bias. And I think that's just because of how they did their analysis. So the kind of takeaway for them was a small but significant effect on multiple cognitive domains that was sort of relevant to processing speed, attention, perceptual or visual spatial skills that are sort of trained or used in these kinds of video games. There is a long discussion at the end in terms of what this does and doesn't mean, and obviously the answer is always we need more research. But I thought it was interesting that they kind of highlighted that because now like everybody games on their phones, everybody, is sort of we're increasingly exposed to these kinds of things, such that I think like more than 90% of young adults say they play video games of some kind. It's going to be increasingly difficult to really separate out the effects of all these different types of games and the effects of different games, and like who acts as a control group, because if the control group has to not play video games, it's just like there aren't any people who don't play video games. And I think that's part of the reason why they were so exacting in like picking the studies that they included.
Right.
But it's just interesting that now there's going to be an ever increasing number of sort of things that are called video games, but are maybe not challenging at the level that we kind of would want them to be in order to drive some of these cognitive functions. Whereas fewer and fewer people are going to be playing these, Xbox attached to a TV kind of with a controller. I think people are doing less of that because you have access to games in other ways. So I think these kind of studies might become harder for those reasons. The control group is going to be a lot messier. Plus, some of these games are going to be, may become less popular as other modalities open up. But certainly super interesting, and seems to suggest that, when you're playing games like this that require you to pay attention to multiple stimuli, orient your person in 3D space, respond to lots of different things coming in at the same time, and sort of challenging your perceptual speed, that these things then translate and transfer over to general improvement in those processes in the real world. And so that's super interesting to see. The takeaway there therefore being that if you're looking for something to help support some of these processes as a training modality, it doesn't have to be formalized brain training. It doesn't have to be, some of the other things that we've mentioned that do similar things. It could be, challenging yourself to take up a new, complex, immersive video game, if that's something you have the interest and sort of equipment to do so.
Good stuff. Your comments there about how we answer some of these questions, as if more and more people are doing it. It seems like there's a need to kind of no longer treat these as a sort of a single category, at least when you're framing them from a cognition standpoint, and maybe also a need to sort of develop some kind of classification schema for categorizing games according to their, the cognitive domains and cognitive load and all that sort of thing. And you could see that being really useful. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, I wonder if this was part of the motivation too. I would have, if I'm trying to select a category of game that I think is kind of most likely to show robust benefits, I'm going to choose something that's sort of real world oriented. That's sort of, this is a simulation of many of the things that you do in the real world, just at a much sort of more higher, more information dense type of setting. And so not surprising to me that would show benefit. And I think that's kind of one sort of thing to think about when choosing something, and when I was thinking about this question in this study, and trying to think of other things, other analogous games besides first person shooters, because I don't actually enjoy those games myself. So you'd mentioned Super Mario 3D World. I think that's a really good example. As a lot of the same skill sets that are involved. As a couple others, I thought of, there's a game called Overcooked. I don't know if you've ever played that, but it's like super demanding. You like work with another person in a restaurant to like make meals and stuff like that. So you have to coordinate with another person, and you're managing all these things at one time. That's another good one. And then the game Splatoon for Nintendo Switch, which is like it's a shooter game, but you're shooting like a squirt gun type of thing, and so that's another one. And then not in this vein, but I think probably similar in terms of cognitive load is Beat Saber, which is a VR game. I think that's that one I would think would have fairly robust benefits. Um, and I think that just kind of, the big picture with this is that, what we're trying to do ultimately is maintain this sort of set of cognitive resources that we have that are that are the things that we use to either support learning or to support execution of our knowledge and skills.
Mm.
So those are basic resources of like processing speed, attention, response inhibition, working memory, which in isolation they don't do anything for us. They're only useful in terms of what they evolved to support, and that's either to kind of help us learn and acquire new knowledge and skills, or to execute that knowledge and skills.
Mm.
And I think a way to think about any endeavor we're doing is the cognitive load of it, and because that is kind of the most direct reflection of the demands on those particular resources, and anything that involves learning is generally going to be a higher load activity, and the more complex learning it is, the higher the load, whereas anything that's involving sort of execution of learned knowledge and skills isn't automatically going to be a high load activity, right? If you're just relying on completely automated networks, you're able to do it on autopilot. Even if it was a high load thing when you first learned it, it's no longer high load, right?
Mm.
But if it's a sort of dynamic, information rich type of environment where you're sort of having to orchestrate all of these different sub skills, with precise timing, like a skill sport at a high level, an expert musician playing and with it and jamming and improvising,
Mm.
or certain video games, right? Like the ones that we talked about. Those all draw upon those sort of high. Even if the skills themselves are largely automated, you're still having to respond at such a high level that it's creating a high cognitive load. The other thing about the video games is oftentimes there's sort of continuous learning baked into them as well. So
Yeah.
that's another huge benefit. And we've talked about this before. They're designed to keep you wanting to play, and they're doing so largely because of the rewards of getting better. So it's
Mm.
like if you can get into that virtuous cycle of feedback where you're continuing to progress at the game, then that's actually a really good thing. That's not to be feared, right? That's sort of like that it makes you want to do it again. Like that's just that's a positive reward signal. Um, the last thing I was thinking about was you mentioned the line they said in there about these games not being like suited for younger people, and I do think that is one of the challenges here is for someone who's sort of not been into gaming for a long
Mm.
time, to get to there's a level of, I mean, I see this with my own son. He games more than I do, and he can pick up a new game really fast,
Yeah.
because he's just used to this controls, used to everything. So his on ramp is much faster,
Mm.
and so that can be frustrating for people. But remember that the worse you are, the more you have to gain is one thing, right? So
Yeah.
that's a helpful framing, at least in the beginning. But it also, I think, speaks to the need for this could be a whole new category of gaming, but one that sort of has slower progressions, slower on ramps to helping people to learn the skills and learn, before moving on to sort of higher level. Most of the games now, I think, are tailored towards people who have a fair amount of gaming experience already and can jump on and not have sort of that initial learning curve they have to go through. So, if anybody else there wants to start building those games, I think that's that's another avenue that's available. But and I do wonder too, like the controller-based games, like those, just the complexity of all of the different things you have to learn in terms of the controls, which has to be simplified on a smartphone or something like that.
Yeah.
I wonder if some of the, I would think that would confer some of the benefits, and that some of those may be, lost when you're moving to a smartphone. Not that it's, zero, but for me, the cognitive load is much higher when trying with the controller, especially since I'm still like have the NES as my base model, which has far fewer buttons than modern controllers. But
That's the original Nintendo
yeah,
for
exactly.
anybody who isn't familiar.
An A B button and a touchpad, and that's it, right? Zero pad.
I remember playing the original Mario on the original Nintendo when I was a kid. That's definitely, although
Yes.
the SNES, the Super Nintendo, which was the next
Mhm.
generation, that was my main
Yeah,
gaming
a few more
console.
buttons.
A few more buttons.
Yep.
And then the N64, where actually I played a lot of shooters like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. and then later Halo. So those were my
Yeah.
kind of game.
I would say overall, this is one thing. Nintendo in general is sort of, if you don't like shooter style games and more like fantasy that are not like killing people and whatever, but have the same kind of gameplay,
Yeah,
that's the good system to go towards.
I agree. I was actually, as you were talking, I think more and more every time I think about video games in the brain, like I always come back to Zelda, mainly because that's my favorite game. But every iteration of Zelda or the Legend of Zelda, they do get more complex, and these are all on Nintendo systems. But even like each new game, you have so many opportunities to on ramp slowly because you're
Hmm.
in like an open world where you can
Right.
test out a lot of the stuff to begin with. So I
Yes,
think they're great
they're
games
better
for
at that.
people. Yeah,
Yes.
I think they're very good games for people who aren't gamers, and
Hmm.
just like the worlds are immersive and
Hmm.
they're a lot of fun to play. Um,
Yeah, Zelda Breath of the Wild for Switch would be a great one.
yeah.
It's up there.
Um, there there are a couple of things that I was thinking about as you were talking. The first is that particularly for processing speed, which is one of the primary
Hmm.
functions that declines with age on average,
Hmm.
it's not very common, unless you are like a musician who regularly
Hmm.
jams, or you play an open skill sport. It's not very common that you do things that require you to respond
Hmm.
very quickly to the environment.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that's where these kinds of video games have a real
100%.
potential for benefit, because
Right.
we do everything at an increasingly sedate pace,
Right.
and
Right.
then function follows that
It,
level of engagement.
and in the real world, the times where you might have to, in sort of daily life, have to respond with that kind of processing speed, it might be like major threats to your life, right? So
Yeah,
you're able to do this in a very safe setting, right?
yeah,
I think about the same thing is true with like pickleball, where you have people firing a ball at you from like point blank range as hard as they can, and you're having to respond. Like that's never gonna, you never have any kind of stimulus where you require that
yeah,
kind of reaction time in your regular life over and over again. So, um, yeah, that's a perfect, a great example is that you're giving yourself level of stimulus that you just couldn't otherwise get. That's gonna cause that system to adapt. Um, the last thing was you were talking about the other thing about this research. Then I think part of why we talk about it is there is such a negative framing oftentimes around video games,
yeah,
not just first person shooters for sure because of the violent aspect, but even video games in general is like, oh, they're just frivolous and rot your brain if you do it too much, and that is so far from the truth. And I go to a gaming convention once a year with my son, and every time I come up away from that, I'm like, I need to game more. Like I'm not doing enough gaming, like for my brain. Like I'm
yeah,
not, so it's like totally. I have the total opposite framing. I feel like I could incorporate more, and this kind of research and these conversations make me want to be a little more deliberate about it. So, which is typically the op. You're trying
yeah,
most conversations around how do you get kids to stop gaming as much, but
yeah, exactly.
um, and just on one little point on that, I think that by and large, if parents who worried about their kids gaming, by and large, the studies are very promising overall.
Mm,
It's more the downsides have to do more with if it's so much that it's crowding out other things that are
yeah,
beneficial for them, right?
yeah,
That's the
exactly.
main. That's always how I've oriented around it, and think that's what the research supports.
Yeah, um, yeah, absolutely. I think if you get to the point where it's affecting sleep,
Right.
physical activity, social relationships, like that kind of stuff, then of course needs to be looked at. But up until that point, certainly all signs point towards potential for benefit.
Right.
Um, and then so now my final point about your controller thing,
Yeah.
we just got a new TV, and it's like one of those sort of smart TVs that's connected to everything.
Hmm.
And there's a bunch of games you can either get online through the platform or connect to like online gaming platforms through it, like Microsoft and Xbox have one, Amazon has one, and then you can get any kind of controllers from Amazon where you sort of like then you play this on the TV, and so you don't need additional consoles, you don't need anything else. So like if you have a relatively modern TV, you can kind of get into some of this stuff
Yeah.
very like the barrier to entry is decreasing all the time. So
Super
I've
fun.
found that very interesting as I was sort of like playing around with this thing
Yeah.
after we set it up.
Yeah. And so if anybody watching this has any games they enjoy playing in this domain, feel free to put it in the comments, and we'll put also some of the ones we mentioned here in this post. But yeah, it'd be good to kind of build a catalog of things in this category that are accessible
Yeah.
to adults. Okay, well, that's thanks, Tommy, for breaking that large study down. Thanks for reading it all, so I didn't have to. Um, if you guys have any other questions about this topic or anything else in the realm of brain health and fitness, feel free to send it our way. You can comment on our Substack or send us a message there. Click the link that's in the podcast description, or you can go to brainjo.academy/questions and leave it there. Otherwise, we will see you guys next time. Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you. And thanks everybody